So I want to thank you for being here today. I'm Mr. Crouse, fourth grade teacher at Reedy Fork Elementary. And we'll start just by maybe introducing you and telling us who you are, what you do, and maybe where you're from.
Yeah, my name is Sonia. I am the education coordinator here at the Charlotte Hawkins Brown Museum, which means that normally I would be greeting everybody on field trips when the buses arrive, but this is a different kind of field trip. So here at the Charlotte Hawkins Brown Museum, we do all kinds of fun things. We give tours, we do events, we have parties, we have tea parties, we do crafts. So this is a little different this year, but I live here in Greensboro, so I live just down the road.
All right, good deal. Now, Charlotte Hawkins Brown, now I know that's over near Sedalia Elementary. I was teacher there for a few years, many years ago, right? But we used to walk over there. What is the deal with Charlotte Hawkins Brown, and who was she?
Yeah, so Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown started a boarding school. So a boarding school is a school that you live at. You live there with your teachers, so sometimes that's really fun. Sometimes it's probably less than fun. But this boarding school was specifically for African American students. Dr. Brown started it in 1902. And that was at a time when not a lot of African American students had equal opportunity education like we do today. So Dr. Brown was only 19 when she started her school. She was born in North Carolina, lived in Massachusetts for a little while, and then moved back down here when she was 19 to open up her school.
Wow, 19. So
Yeah.
to be a teacher today, of course, you're 18-ish when you graduate from high school, and then you have to do a 4-year degree. Some people go on and do more. So looking at 24 to even have a license to start being a teacher, let alone starting your own school, how does that happen?
Yeah, so Dr. Brown did 1 year of teaching college. The teaching college was a little different than it is today. You only had to do 2 years. She only did one, and she moved down to North Carolina because she got a job here. Teaching at a school that closed really quickly. They ran out of money. So she decided, though, that this was an area that really needed education for students. So she was just really motivated and really excited. She took a building that was a blacksmith shop and she converted it into her classroom. And that's where she started. She started with 5 students, and eventually 2,000 students ended up graduating from her school.
I'm sorry, did you say 2,000 students?
Yeah, the school was open until 1971. So for 69 years, the school was open and 2,000 students graduated from Palmer.
Wow, all from what used to be a blacksmith shop. That is just mind-blowing. Wow.
Yep. And she did it all on her own. She really didn't have a whole lot of help here. She moved down here by herself, which was probably really scary for her. She's in a new place. She didn't know anybody. She's an African-American woman in the South. And the South at that time really wasn't a super friendly place for African-American women. So she kind of crossed all these hurdles and then decided to open up her school.
So when she opened up the school, was this school for boys and girls?
It was, yep. From the very beginning, it was always co-ed. So since it was a boarding school, though, since the students lived here, the boys lived in one building on one side of campus and the girls lived in a different building on the very other side of campus. And then the teachers all lived kind of in between.
Wow. So was Charlotte Hawkins Brown, Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown, like the principal then?
Yeah, so she was called the president of the school, but that's kind of like what a principal is today.
Okay. How many teachers did she have helping her?
Her first year, she only had 1 or 2. And over the course of the school, as the school grew, as it got more students, it needed more teachers. So she ended up having many, many teachers, like a regular school today, about as many teachers as a school has today.
Okay. So, but when they started out, maybe were like, who's her clientele? Were they siblings or, was it people who were local here, or did people move from like far away to attend school since you said that school wasn't really a priority at that time for African-American children, right?
Right.
And so since this was kind of a rarity, was it sought out, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Yeah, so initially, the school was really for local students, so students that lived really, really close to her school. And it was for K through 12, so any age of student. The mission of the school, so what Dr. Brown was focusing on, changed about 20 years after she opened the school. So she started with teaching agriculture and manual training, because that's at the time in the early 1900s, that's what people felt like African American students needed to learn. Dr. Brown knew that just because her students were African American, they could learn whatever they wanted. So she ended up switching her focus of her school to be college prep to get her students ready to go to college, and liberal arts. So they were doing things like dance and music and taking English classes. So once that mission of the school shifted, there were students coming from all over the country and all over the world. We had a lot of international students at Palmer because this wasn't an education that a lot of African American students could get many places. So it was a really unique place with a really unique curriculum.
So starting out, you said agriculture, which is, I guess, farming. Was that like livestock and crops?
Yep. And the school had its own farm. So the school had a 300-acre farm, and the food provided from the farm fed the students. The students were some of the people working on the farm to help harvest all those crops. And then they'd also sell the crops to make money for the school.
And this was in the early 1900s.
1902 is when she started the school, yep.
All right. How far out of, I guess, slavery was that?
So that's almost 50 years. But we're looking right after this point where African Americans have started having roles in government, in state and federal government. But the South was a particularly unfriendly place for a lot of African Americans. It could be really dangerous. There was still a lot of segregation. So segregation means kind of separation. So Black students and white students weren't allowed to go to school together. They weren't allowed to go to the movie theater together. They weren't even allowed to use the same drinking fountains, which is why a school like Palmer, specifically for Black students, is really important.
And I think that's one of the things as fourth graders and even as us adults trying to put together a timeline. Like we've been studying up through like the Tuscarora War and you know, we were kind of this buffer between the Native Americans and the colonists. And then we had the Revolutionary War, and we're getting ready to go to the Civil War. So, I mean, finding out where this fit in. So this is about 50 years after, I guess, the Civil War then? Yeah,
so after the Civil War ends in 1865, there's this period of American history called Reconstruction. And the name is pretty apt. So Reconstruction, the country is trying to figure out again how this system works. So there's no longer slavery, which means people aren't owned by other people anymore. And that totally changes the economy, so the way that money works. It changes the way that labor works and how farms and businesses are run. So this is part of that kind of Reconstruction. So figuring out how African American citizens are free and equal citizens, just like white citizens.
Good deal. So, and going back, you said agriculture and manual labor, I believe.
Manual training. So that's things like working on like tractors or construction, kind of labor you use your hands for.
Okay. And you know, it's so funny. Like we're talking to students who believe that Google has always been a thing, right?
Yeah.
So, realizing that there weren't computers back then, there weren't cell phones, there was still, like I remember my grandpa was born in 1905 and they didn't have an indoor restroom until about 1998.
Yeah.
I mean, that is just, so 1902 is 96 years prior to that. Was there electricity and running water and things like that for the school?
There wasn't initially. So at the very beginning, it was pretty bare bones. Dr. Brown's home, so Dr. Brown built her own house here on campus that she lived in. That had electricity and indoor plumbing 30 years before the rest of the town did. But just because she had electricity and indoor plumbing, she didn't have a TV. She never had a TV. She didn't have any internet. There was one phone on the whole campus. So if a student had to come use the phone, they'd have to go to their principal's house to do that. Teacher would have to use that phone. So when students had to do research for their classes, or if they had a question, instead of Googling it or emailing their teacher, they'd have to look in something called an encyclopedia, which is a really big book with lots and lots of topics and lots of answers to questions. So we have a lot of encyclopedias here on campus still.
Wow.
Google is much faster. Google's much faster.
It's true. It's true. You had to have a certain skill set, I think, to find anything in an encyclopedia.
Yeah.
So, okay. So what would students experience now if they were to come with their families to visit you? Can they do that, first of all?
Yeah.
And if they were, what would their experience be like there?
So if you came to visit us, which you can, we're here all the time. Sometimes it feels like we never go home. You get to kind of walk back in time, which is a really cool part of visiting museums. So a lot of people, when they visit a museum, it's one really big building and you see artifacts in big cases with big labels on the wall. Our museum looks pretty different. Our museum is a historic site, which means that you get to walk around the campus, you get to look in the windows of the dorms where the students lived, you get to feel what it was like to walk all the way from the boys' dorm, all the way to the dining hall. We get to take you inside of Dr. Brown's home. Her home is decorated for the 1940s, so it's kind of like stepping back in time. You get to walk in and pretend you're living in the 1940s. And we talk a little bit about Dr. Brown and her life and what it was like to be a student. But it's really like stepping back in time.
Really cool. Wow.
Yeah.
So is there anything that you would like to share with us that's kind of your favorite?
Yeah. I was going to show some photos. I'm actually going to share my screen. No, it won't let me. That's okay. I have backups. So I was going to show some photos of students here. And then students at home can decide if this looks like their school experience or their home experience or not. My school experience certainly looked very different. So here I have a photo of students during a May Day celebration. So May Day was celebrated on the first weekend of May. But see all these super fancy dresses and all these fancy suits, right?
Yeah.
That's not really what we look like when we go to school anymore. We can wear pants.
Right.
Wear
the guys were
sweatshirts.
wearing some things on their heads, it looked like.
Yeah, do you see the crowns? That's the May Day Queen, and that's the May Day King. So the students would vote on a May Day court. So there'd be a May Day King, Queen, Princess, and Prince.
Is that kind of like homecoming now?
Sort of, yeah. Palmer students did a lot of celebrations because they weren't at home to celebrate things with their families, right? They lived here at school. So they would have May Day celebrations, homecoming celebrations, Christmas events. All the students got together and did Christmas together or Thanksgiving together. So there was always I think there were a lot of parties that were happening here at Palmer. Here is another photo. So this is the dining hall here on campus. Since the students lived on campus, that also meant that they ate on campus. And the building on your background behind you, that's our dining hall now. So that's what it still looks like. Yep, that's Kimball Hall. But all of the students sat together at these big tables like this. And then this guy, he was a student, and he was designated as the head waiter of the school. So Dr. Brown taught something called etiquette here at Palmer, which is sort of like manners. So if you've ever been told, get your elbows off the table or do with your mouth closed. Etiquette was really important for Dr. Brown. So she taught it here at the school. So this head waiter's job was to make sure that everybody was following all of those etiquette rules all the time.
Wow. So that brings a question. So, if you don't follow the rules at school, like you might get a phone call home or you might, forbidden, have to go talk to the principal, right?
Yeah.
Were there disciplinary issues at Dr. Brown's school, at Palmer School?
Yeah, she was very strict. Part of that is because this was the school that she built. She had a reputation to uphold, but she also really expected the best out of her students. So sometimes if you broke a rule, depending on what rule you broke, you might have detention, you might have extra chores on campus, something like that. But she would send students home. So she once sent a student home from the dining hall. He had his eyes open during a prayer before a meal.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so she just was not having it. So she sent him home. That student's name was A.D. King. He was the younger brother of Martin Luther King Jr.
Oh my goodness.
Mm-hmm.
What
and she sent him home.
Story.
So imagine though, if you get sent home. So this school you had to pay money to go to, or your parents paid money for you to go to. So if you got sent home, you were getting in trouble at school. And then I have to imagine that your parents, who just spent a lot of money to send you to the school, were not very happy because they didn't get a refund. So I imagine you also got in trouble at home too.
Wow. And so that brings up a whole nother just concept of, first of all, the South wasn't a friendly place to African American people to begin with.
Hmm.
We're 50-ish years out of slavery,
Hmm.
and we're probably not getting equitable wages compared to our white counterparts.
Right.
And so families have to work and save money and make sacrifices to send their children to school. I can imagine that probably there wasn't a lot of disciplinary stuff because children would probably be very aware of what their parents were giving up to send them so that they could get a better education and better life.
Yeah. So school today sometimes feels like a real chore. Like sometimes you're not excited to go to school. School then, though, especially for African American students, it was a real privilege. So there weren't a ton of disciplinary experiences or disciplinary issues. Um, because the school charged money, though, that made it out of reach for a lot of families that couldn't afford that. Just financially, some parents didn't have the money to send their kids or several kids. But Dr. Brown often offered like work study, or you could do extra chores or jobs on campus that would help supplement that tuition. So she never turned anybody away from Palmer because of cost, but it certainly was a factor.
Wow. Wow. That is just so much different than what we have today, right?
It is very different, yeah.
So,
But in the same way, it's similar. So students were learning the same things. They were going to math class and science and social studies and English language arts. But they were also taking classes like there was a class called Discussions in Democracy, where they just got together and discussed democracy. There were home ec classes. So girls took, they were called domestic science classes, and that's where you learned how to cook for a family or keep your house clean or entertain or pay bills. So it was similar, but there were also some big differences.
and to be clear, those are all skills that we need today, male or female, to be successful adults.
Oh
We need
yeah,
to be clean in a house and our self-hygiene. And
yep.
yeah, wow, that's really neat. So I guess, could you tell us about maybe what your specific job is? Like, do you have a title, what you do?
Yeah, so my job here is education coordinator, but we're a really small staff. There's only 3 of us, which means that we wear a lot of hats and we do a lot of different things. So some days I'm giving tours or doing field trips. Other days I'm in our archives doing research. So looking at old photos or old class schedules or old letters from Dr. Brown. And then other days I am out doing yard work. It just kind of depends. Which is one of the things I love the most about this job, is that every day when I come to work, I don't really know what I'm going to be doing. Makes it very exciting. I'm never bored.
I think education is sometimes the same way.
Yeah, you never really know what you're stepping into.
Right. Every day is an adventure.
Right.
So if I was a student who had an interest in history and current events and that sort of facet, how would I go about becoming a Sonia? What would I
Yeah.
do?
So I took a lot of history classes and social studies classes in middle school and high school, and then I majored in history when I got to college. So when you major in history, there's a lot of different things you can do. You can be a teacher. You can go to law school and be a lawyer. You could not use your history degree. It just depends. I was really interested in how we learn history through museums and historic monuments and memorials. I think that's really interesting. So I went to graduate school at UNC Greensboro, and I got my master's degree in public history and museum studies. So I learned my history through museums and monuments as opposed to textbooks. And that's kind of how we teach our history here. So if you come to see me on a field trip, I'm not going to show you a textbook like you might have in school. I'm going to show you a building. I'm going to show you an artifact, so an object that was used a long time ago. So you can major in history, and then I get involved in your local museums and historic sites. You can get involved as a junior volunteer at a lot of places really young. Museums and historic sites always need help. They always need Volunteers, we take junior volunteers, so if anybody wants to come hang out with me,
Okay.
pretty fun.
What is your youngest junior volunteers?
Our youngest junior volunteers are in 4th grade.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. We also have a kids history club here called the Tar Heel Junior Historians. And they were all in 4th grade this year. So this year they did research into what crops Dr. Brown had on the campus farm here. And then they built a planter box and planted those crops, and it's outside Dr. Brown's house now.
So I'm not guaranteeing any A's in social studies, but if any of our 4th graders come and volunteer, I think that would definitely be worth some extra bonus. Absolutely. So if you have any Reedy Fork Rangers show up there, please.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Okay, well, I'm not sure I have any other questions. If there's anything else you would like to share.
I am happy to talk with any student at any time. I'll give you my email. You've got my email. So any student is welcome to contact me if you have more questions or want to learn more. I am happy to help.
That is awesome. And I'm sure we will have some questions, and I will send them to you. As far as you 4th graders, if you have any questions, if you'll let your teacher know, myself, Miss Glidewell, or Miss Lineberry, then I will get them to Miss Laney here, and we will get them answered. And I'm serious about extra bonus points. If you want to go and hang out and be a junior, what was a junior? It's not a junior ranger. We're rangers. A junior
volunteer.
Junior volunteer, if you want to be a junior volunteer, either at the Charlotte Hawkins Brown Museum or at one of the other historic sites. I guess real quick, Sonia, if you could tell us, one of the things that we are learning about is historic sites, monuments, museums, that sort of thing, why we have them. Do you have any insight maybe as to what it says about us as a society? And I know that's a really deep question, but what it says about us as a society and our culture that we would need to memorialize, have a museum, honor Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown?
Yeah, so monuments and memorials are really important, right? They symbolize that something or someone or someplace was important enough that we want to remember it. We want to put it in our collective memory. So as North Carolinians, as Greensboro residents, as Americans, we have tons of monuments and memorials. If you've ever visited Washington, D.C., there's one on like every single corner. So for Dr. Brown to have a monument and a memorial here at the Charlotte Hawkins Brown Museum, I mean, she's got a whole museum dedicated to her. That's pretty good. That should tell you that she was really important in this area and in North Carolina. It can be really kind of rare sometimes to find monuments and memorials to women. There are a lot of monuments and memorials to men. There's a whole lot out there. Less for women, and certainly even fewer for African American women. So as you look at monuments and memorials in your town, in the state, in your country, think really critically about who that person was and what they did and when they did it and where they did it, right? So it's those 5 W's that we learn in school: who, what, when, where, why. Think really critically and do your own research to learn more about the different statues and the different monuments and memorials.
And I know in recent times there's been a lot of news highlights and stories about monuments and things that people maybe aren't in agreement with. And so I think that's something too that students need to realize, that somebody had a monument resurrected because they were important to someone.
Exactly, yeah. And pay attention to where those monuments are. So a monument in a cemetery kind of has a very different meaning than a monument, say, outside of a courthouse. Wow. So pay attention to where those monuments are, when they were put up, so when they were created. That's really important to look at too. In your local community, Guilford Courthouse National Military Park, which is not far from you guys, has a lot of memorials and monuments. So if you want to go, you can walk around, you can kind of practice all of those critical thinking skills about who it's a monument for, why is it there, when was it put up. You can do all kinds of kind of practice on your own.
I once saw a meme that said, live your life as if you wanted someone to resurrect a monument.
Yes, that is a good way to live your life.
Listen, I want to thank you. just very sincerely thank you for your time with us, and
Absolutely.
I look forward to continued conversation with you.
Perfect.
So, again, ladies and gentlemen, viewing this, just think about what Miss Laney said, who the monument represents, why it's there, when was it resurrected, what is it? Because it's not always a person; it may be a column or a pillar.
Yep.
So, what is it? And I've just forgot the last W.
Who, what, when it was put up, where,
Where is?
and why? Why did somebody decide that that person or that thing or that place was important enough to get its own monument?
Because you're right. Sometimes it's not a person that they're memorializing. Sometimes it's an event.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
all right. Well, thank you so much. And I'm
You're
going to stop
welcome.
recording there. And I look forward to more time with you.
Awesome.